Hi, my name is Bronson Allen, and I will be talking about the downfall of Sega around the late 90s and start of the 21st century. I know that Sega was covered a little bit in class and within the history book. However, I would like to focus more on the events that led to the demise of Sega. While Sega is of course still around to this day, they are not the same company that went head-to-head with Nintendo back in the 90s. Nintendo vs. Sega was the first console war. Sega had their infamous marketing line, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. I would like to just review some of the important people and events that birthed this rivalry. While Sega may have gone to war with Nintendo in the early 80s, it wasn't until the 90s that the company started to gain some ground. Part of this is because Sega purposefully started to market against Nintendo, openly insulting Mario and Nintendo consoles in order to make their stuff seem better. This not only made Nintendo's reputation worse, but it put Sega on the map by branding themselves as Nintendo's rival. And being Nintendo's biggest rival was an impressive enough title on its own in order to get games to sell. After all, Nintendo in the 90s was massive in comparison to any other video game competitor. They owned 94% of the $3 billion gaming market. Sega was minuscule in comparison. However, Sega was able to find greater success in the American market than they were in Japan, and this was due to their marketing strategies and the release of their own mascot that could rival Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic was made in 1991 for the Sega Genesis for the sole purpose of being a rival to Mario, and he greatly succeeded, as Sega started to advertise their mascot, games, and consoles as cooler and faster than Mario was. Sega opposed Nintendo's marketing strategy by having their games be incredibly in-your-face, loud, rude, and attention-catching. In the 90s, Sonic was advertised as a rebellious and snarky, fast-paced icon that could appeal to teens. Sonic was not only iconic for his character design and attitude, but his games were designed just as well as Mario's. The game's levels were adorned with colorful landscapes, while upbeat, fast-paced music played in the background. The game was perfect for Sonic's character, and Green Hill Zone's name has become just as significant as World 1-1. A great deal of this success was due to the plans of Sega America CEO Tom Kalinske. Kalinske worked for Mattel from 1972 and was the previous CEO of Sega America from 1990 to 1996. Kalinske was known as a genius in the toy market for reviving the Barbie dolls and Hot Wheel toy lines. Sega Japan's CEO Hayao Nakayama personally seeked out Kalinske to specifically become the CEO of Sega America. And it worked out great, as Tom Kalinske would raise the market worth of Sega from beneath $2 billion to more than $5 billion. Kalinske knew exactly how to market Sega in order for it to be successful, and even created the Genesis does what Nintendo don't line. When Kalinske took over Sega, he was promised and given complete control of Sega America, who had been struggling previously. Kalinske immediately came up with a 4-step plan to advance the company forward. First, he started to bundle consoles with Sonic games in order to solidify the company's mascot and build up the company's future success. Then, he lowered the price of the Genesis from $189 to $149 in order to have the price be much lower than Nintendo's SNES. He also started to advertise towards teenagers and older players instead of kids, in order to give Sega a more mature theme, since Nintendo already dominated the kids' market. Last, he started to make games that would appeal more to American audiences by having American celebrities such as Joe Montana and Michael Jackson appear in commercials for their own video games. The genesis and the ideas of Kalinske led to great success for Sega in North America during the early 90s. However, this success would be short-lived, as Sega would find themselves in the middle of a massive transition in video game history during the release of one of their worst consoles. The dreaded transition from the second dimension to the third was something that Sega was woefully unprepared for with their newest console, the Sega Saturn. The Saturn was just the beginning of a long line of mistakes that Sega would make over the next 10 years. Even before the Saturn would come out, Sega had released the Sega CD and the 32X as add-ons to the Genesis. They both, however, would be failures in sales. They were not as big as the Saturn's failure, but they still made a dent on Sega financially beforehand. The reason Sega made the Sega CD in the first place was because of the rising popularity of CDs as a new entertainment medium. And part of the reason the Sega CD was a failure was because of the release of the game Night Trap, one of the movie-like games that could be played with the Sega CD. The game featured violence against women and became extremely controversial in the US, as consumers were extremely uncomfortable with the idea of kids finding and playing that game. This ruined the Sega CD's reputation. Sega was also testing new concepts for their consoles or games, and oftentimes they would fail as a result of their own innovation. The Saturn was a failure mostly due to it being very difficult to program games for, and also because of the release of two very successful competing consoles only a few years later, the Nintendo 64 and Sony's PlayStation. The 64 and PlayStation had new innovative 3D graphics, while the Saturn still relied on 32-bit games. Consoles were not the only thing suffering in Sega. Sega's leading franchise, Sonic, would face a massive decline in quality as a result of 3D. The animation quality, graphics, and overall design of 3D Sonic just did not look as polished or precise as its competitors did in 3D. This was mostly due to the overall design of Sonic simply not working in a 3D space as compared to a 2D space. The character was simply just too fast for 3D, and also did not look as appealing as it did in 2D space. Even to this day, Sega still has a difficult time producing 3D Sonic games. Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast is considered a disaster by the gaming community for its clunky controls, boring levels with Sonic side characters, and abundance of glitches. This game was one of the many nails in Sega's coffin, as their mascot was no longer able to keep up with Mario. Gaming was simply changing, and 3D was the newest trend that Sega had to hop on, along with Sony and Nintendo. While the Dreamcast had some great games, such as Jet Set Radio and Soul Calibur, it came out at the wrong time, and also destroyed the Sega Saturn in the process. 3D became a very real threat to game developers that now had to innovate some of their games in creative ways in order to appeal to audiences. For some, 3D became a new realm of possibility for their franchises, like for Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, Legend of Zelda. While for others, like Sonic, it destroyed them. To video game enthusiasts, purchasing the $300 more innovative PlayStation was a no-brainer in comparison to the $400 Saturn. The Sega Saturn was never really even meant to be successful, as many Sega employees, including Tom Kalinske, saw the console as a failure, and they instead started to focus on developing the Dreamcast early into the Saturn's lifespan. This also ended up disappointing a lot of Sega's fans that did purchase a Saturn. As you can see by this graph here, Sega dug themselves into a massive hole right before the release of 3D. Moving from 2D to 3D posed a threat to Sega's game developers, as they were reliant upon quick changes to compete with Nintendo. Their understanding of game advancement, game improvement programming, and cutoff points proved a difficult task for them all. While Sega was known as an innovative company that tried out-of-the-box ideas, they started to struggle when it came to learning an all-new way to program. Their games, in comparison to Nintendo's, simply didn't match up. Sega thrived off of their rivalry with Nintendo, and for a while they seemed like they could keep up. But Mario's jump from 2D to 3D was a massive leap. It's pretty much unanimously agreed upon that Super Mario 64 is the best 2D to 3D transition in video game history. Nintendo made just the right adjustments to the popular Mario formula to help the game feel unique without overwhelming past fans. For being a first-generation 3D game, Super Mario 64 holds up remarkably well today and is a shining example of Nintendo's thoughtful game design. Sonic Adventure wasn't only a dud, but it was being compared to Super Mario 64 because of the long-standing rivalry that has been built between Sega and Nintendo. There is no longer a contest between the two now, on which game was the better choice, because now the choice had become obvious. The rivalry was now dead. While Sega's games were struggling, their consoles were too. The Saturn was still nowhere near as popular as the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. Sega would have avoided this, however, had they made better choices in the past, decisions that could have possibly led to them having the Nintendo 64, PlayStation, or Xbox consoles for themselves. First was the Nintendo 64. Silicon Graphics took their SGI system to Tom Kalinske, the system that would later become the Nintendo 64. Kalinske saw potential in the console. However, Sega America was not in charge of making decisions about consoles, as they only focused on manufacturing games. When Silicon Graphics took their console to Sega Japan, they said that the console had too many issues and was simply not good enough. When Sony wanted to partner with Sega in order to take down Nintendo, Tom Kalinske yet again saw potential in the partnership. However, Sega Japan yet again rejected the offer, stating that Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. A lot of these vetoes of Kalinske's ideas were believed to be because Sega Japan were jealous of the success that Sega America was receiving. This would eventually lead to Kalinske leaving the company after butting heads with Sega Japan. Next was the partnership of Microsoft and Sega to add Windows CE to the Dreamcast, an online functionality that was meant more for the programmers rather than the consumers. Not much else came out of the partnership as the Dreamcast lifespan ended in 2001. Microsoft would then go on alone to make the Xbox the same year. What Sega did end up with was the Dreamcast as their last console they would ever make. While the console had a very successful launch, the console's sales started to drop with the release of the extremely popular PlayStation 2. Sega is no longer the Sega that challenged Nintendo back in the 90s that Kalinske hoped would stand at the top. No more consoles have been made by Sega since the Dreamcast, and now they simply make games for their old rivals' consoles. They no longer can compete in the console war, and Nintendo's rivals as Sony and Microsoft have now taken their place. When Sega made consoles, they were always behind Nintendo in sales, no matter what generation. The NES outsold the SG-100 and Master System by approximately 50 million units. The SNES outsold Sega's best-selling system by 18.35 million. The Game Boy outsold Sega's handheld console, the Game Gear, by a massive 108.07 million. The Game Gear was unable to find success due to its low battery life being too expensive for consumers to continually replenish. Then, the Nintendo 64 outsold the Sega Saturn by 23.67 million. However, these sales numbers were never too big a factor for Sega, since they at least were second place and could stand on the same pedestal as the behemoth that was Nintendo. Sega was the David to Nintendo's Goliath, and without them, it's possible that Nintendo could have gained complete control over the entire gaming market with little resistance. Sega is now a company that stands on the sidelines of the console wars that are going on right now. However, their rivalry with Nintendo coined the term console wars, and Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft wouldn't be where they are without them. The rivalry between Sega and Nintendo is not quite the same as it is now, and there's more friendly cooperation between the two companies, as you can find Sonic making appearances in Nintendo games because of his iconic role in video game history as the character that stood next to Mario. Mario is a character so recognizable in the video game industry that no other video game icon has even come close to his level of notability other than Sonic. Sega may not be the same company it was then, but they will always have Sonic. As much as people like to poke fun at the company for its downfall and current status in internet culture, Sega earned a major spot in video game history.